want to thank Francis and Al and the staff for inviting me here tonight. As Francis mentioned, I worked here for many years. And this evening I was raking up the fire pit, helping out a bit, and it occurred to me that this was my 50th year as part of the camp community. So I came to the original Columbus Boys Camp when I was 10 years old with my two brothers. If you do the math, it's back in 1964, and in 1964, there were the Giants back then. And you heard of the name Hammer. And Hammer was the program director back in 1964 when I was 10 years old. And Hobo was the director back then. And those two people became my close friends. So I'm honored and I'm privileged and humbled to be here tonight to share a story with you. And I would like to honor as well the lands of the Chippewa of this area. And this night is part of a great tradition that we've had at the camp since 1929, where we've all gathered together as a community of faith, of brothers and of sisters, in sharing our lives together. And my hope would be that your time here, the campers here together, that your time here will be special with your counselors, and that you will grow up and have the same kind of experiences that I have. So I'm humbled and privileged to be here. There is a saying that we have at camp. We say that we stand on the shoulders of giants before us. And we honor those giants tonight, Hammer and Hobo and Dirt and Ed Raftis and Martina and all those people who've come before us, Tim O'Connor, all those people who've enlivened this camp community. So tonight I want to share with you a story. And this story takes place many, many years ago, when nature and man and people and humankind worked together. This is a story that takes place in the far west, in the land of the Haida Nation, in a small village called Temlahan, in the mountains of British Columbia, near the Skeena River. And the Skeena River is a very, very wide river in British Columbia. This river's teeming with salmon and fish. And in the mountains were mountain goats, and there was food abundant for all the people of Temlahan. But there came a time in that village of Temlahan where the hunters would go out into the hills and they would kill mountain goats. But they wouldn't just kill the mountain goats for food. They would rip out the kidneys and the intestines for their fat. They became cruel. They killed animals for no reason. There was destruction everywhere in the mountains. Dead, bloated bodies of mountain goats. One time, hunters were in the mountains, and they killed many animals. And there was one small goat called a kid. And this kid was sitting beside his dead mother. So one of the hunters went over to that goat and picked him up under his arm. And he carried that goat down the mountain because it would become a toy for the children. And as violent as those hunters were, as mean as they were, their children were mean. And he took that goat down the mountain path, and he dropped the mountain goat around a campfire, much like this. Put it down for the children to play with. But these children were mean. And they took that goat, and they picked it up, and they brought it to the river, and they threw it in the river. And the water was freezing. And that small kid was screaming in the water because it was so cold. So they picked up the goat, and they brought it near the fire. But so close to the fire that they could smell the fur of that poor goat burn. And it screamed in pain. And its face was starting to turn red. And they grabbed the goat, and they threw it back in the river. And it screamed again. And the children were laughing. So they picked up the goat, and they brought it back to the fire, until one young boy saw this and was saddened in his heart to see the pain of this goat. So that young boy, no older than 12, ran over to the goat and picked it up and walked away from the campfire and looked at his friends, looked at his brothers and his sisters, and walked away from them, wondering how they could have been so cruel. And as he moved away from the fire, that young man reached into his pockets and took out a red ointment called okra. And he took that okra and he put it over the goat's face and on the back of his neck to soothe the burn. And so he took that goat far from the village, near the mountain, and he said to that goat, "Here, little one, never come back to this land here." And the goat ran off the trail, back into the mountain. Little did the people of Temlahan know that the mountain goats in the high mountain pass could see what had happened. And they swore revenge. They knew hunters needed them for food. They understood that. But they did not understand the kind of destruction that they were having. They wanted revenge. Early the next day, strangers appeared in the village. There must have been as maybe as 10 large men with goatskin blankets and goat headdresses walking into the village. And as they came into the village, they invited the leaders of the village to come to a feast in the high mountain. Come to the high mountain, they said. These men were large, with long goatskin capes and impressive headdresses. And the villagers of Temlahan said, yes, let's go, we'll go there. The hunters said, no, the women, the children stay behind. The hunters will go to the mountain. But meanwhile, you're here. Come join us for a feast here. So these strangers sat down with them. And as they sat down, their big cloaks around them, something strange. As they were eating, their capes covered their faces and their mouth. And what they were doing is they were taking their food and putting it behind them. And when the feast ended, what happened? And everyone had left back to their huts and cabins. They took that food and they threw it down. And a small young man, a small boy, said to one of his parents, "There's something about these strangers. I saw them with their heads on the ground, and they were eating grass." And the parents said, "That's nothing, stop it." And they didn't believe the boy. So the next morning, the strangers of the village said, come now to the feast." So they started walking along the path, high up the path, into the mountain. And as they approached up the mountainside, they could see a huge log cabin. And this log cabin was perched on the edge of a cliff. And surely the villagers of Temlahan wanted to know, why would they put a cabin so close to the edge of a cliff? But they climbed up and up. And they did not know that young man followed them. The young man that had saved that goat followed them. He wanted to know what was up in that hills. And as he got higher and higher, the goat people said, come in to this cabin. Sit here. And all the hunters were guided to one part of the building. But the goat men, with their capes and their headdresses, were brought to the other end. When that young man from Temlahan came in, a young boy pulled him aside and said, come, stay with me. Come here. Come sit near the post. Now listen, he said, if the chief starts to dance, you must stay here and hold on to me and don't let go. He knew something was going to happen. And at that point, the chief of the mountain goats, with his long cape and his headdress, started to dance. And in this building was a small fire. He started to dance. And he danced around. And the villager and the hunter saw him dance and wondered what's happening. And he jumped over the fire. And he jumped back over the fire again. And all of a sudden, something changed about this goat man. He turned into the largest mountain goat they'd ever seen. And this mountain goat screamed out, "My hoofs make the mountain tremble!" And he smashed his foot down. And he rushed against the side of a wall, and he kicked the wall. And the wall came crashing out. And he yelled, went to the other side, and he said, "My hoofs cry for revenge." And with that, he jumped up and kicked the other wall out. And when that happened, the whole roof collapsed and the wall collapsed, and all of the hunters of Temlahan crashed down the mountainside into a giant cavernous abyss. Falling, screaming, yelling. And at that time, all of the goat men became goats again. There was nothing left of the building. The young man who had saved that goat was screaming in fear and was holding on to the young boy, but the young boy was no longer a young boy. But that young boy was now a goat. And the goat looked at him and he said, "Do not be afraid. I am here with you. Hold on to me. I am the kid that you saved. Look at my neck. This is where you put the red ointment on." But the young boy was still frightened. He was holding on to the edge of this cliff. He didn't know what to do. He saw all the hunters had died. He was the only one left. So that goat said, "Listen to me. Watch what I do." And he put on a cloak and he jumped. He says, when you jump, you say, "To the sand," and you jump. "To the ledge," and you jump. Watch. And the goat jumped to the sand. Then he said, "To the ledge," and he jumped to the ledge. But the boy was terrified. So the goat gave him his cloak and his goat shoes. "Here, take this, borrow this for now." And so the young boy was so frightened he didn't know what to do. But he believed in the goat. So he pushed off from the ledge, out into the air. And he yelled, "To the ledge!" And he landed on the ledge. And he stood there. And he saw some sand below, and he pushed off again, and he fell to the sand. And he did this again and again and again until he got to the bottom of the mountain. he got to the bottom of the mountain. He took off his cloak. He took off those shoes. And he placed them in a bush for his friend. And he walked quietly, sadly back to his village. And when he got back to his village, around a campfire much like this, all that were left were the women and the children. And he said to them, we must learn a lesson from what happened today, that we must respect the animals that we use for our sustenance. We must respect the animals that we eat and clothe ourselves in. We need to respect the mountain. And from that day on, the village of Temlahan used as its emblem, used as its symbol, a giant goat head. So when people came by that village, they saw that goat head in honor of the goats in the high mountains. And they honored that promise. And even today, if you ever go along the Skeena River, there will be totem poles of goat heads. And that is to honor the villages along that river, the village of Temlahan, and the goats in those mountains. I shared this story with you as part of the tradition of this camp, that we honor our First Nation peoples, we honor the land, we honor the waters, and we honor each other.